So, this week in the Sacred Gathering, we will continue our Lenten journey looking through the book of Lamentations. As we talked about last week, we are working our way through kind of this chiastic structure, the fact that we found the kind of center point, this point of hope and trusting God despite the circumstances. And the way the book is kind of structured up to that point, we start with kind of this devastation, this wondering, this emptiness of where is God. Then kind of an angry section where God is more active and involved in the judgment that the people have had. We get to chapter 3, and then we look at hope. We say, okay, is God present? Is God still with us? Can God still bring renewal? And then we work our way back out of in this chiasm, right? So this week we'll be in chapter 4. We're back with some of the judgment. We're back with God being more active. And then next week we'll work our way the rest of the way back out to kind of questions of abandonment and where is God in the midst of this. So again, I think the most important part is, of course, that centerpiece, that place of hope in the midst of darkness. But we continue the conversation this week in chapter 4 of looking at God's involvement in some very dark passages here. This is one of the darkest passages, I think, in a lot of the Bible. And it makes me kind of think of the question of what do we do with passages like this? Why does God allow things like this to be expressions of community life and spiritual life in which we have this? This is something that God's people have preserved and is available to us because it is somehow useful to our view of the world. It is useful to our connection with God. So that's what we'll kind of wrestle with. I did want to kind of point out, and I'm going to approach this week a little bit differently, something that one of my seminary professors said, in that we need to be a little careful in approaching the Bible, in that we can tend to find weird passages, we can tend to find obscure things or offensive things, and not keep them in kind of conversation with the rest of the Bible. And he compared it to listening to a song in stereo. And so it made me think of recently, I've got these little headphones you can put in. And recently I threw one of these in while I was doing the dishes, but I wanted to keep one ear out so I could make sure I could hear the kids as they were either doing homework or fighting, whatever they were doing. And I was listening to a song that I knew and I liked, and as I'm washing dishes, I'm starting like, did I put my MP3 player on the wrong? Did I put it on the wrong song? Because this doesn't sound at all like what I was expecting. Like, where's that main guitar part? That seems to be the part I like about the song. And I realized that I put the other headphone in, that it was mixed as it should be in stereo, right? The guitar part I liked, the part I was listening for was actually in the other headphone. You don't hear it unless you have both of them in. And so as I would switch back and forth, I heard an almost different song. Because the mix, the instruments that were available in each of my ears went together to form a full experience of the song. But when you pull it apart, take these parts kind of in isolation, the song doesn't sound complete. It doesn't make sense. The pieces don't quite fit together. And I think this is an approach we need to have at times with the Bible. There are going to be passages that feel confusing and baffling, that just don't seem like God is behaving in the way we expect God to. It doesn't seem to fit into the overall story. And I think that those passages still have a place in the story, but I think they need to be kept kind of in stereo. They have a place, but we also need to listening to other parts of the Bible as well. And I think not all parts of the Bible are equally useful. They don't all carry equal weight. I think that's an insight that people have had since the very beginning as they were gathering these books and collecting the Bible and being guided by the Spirit in that. Some passages are more useful than others, but they all need to be kept in tension. They all need to be kept in kind of this stereo of the overall. And so I share that because I think that's important for the passage we've got here. If you just take this passage in isolation, it's just a very harrowing passage. It's a nasty passage, and it can give us some very wrong views of both God and the people here, because it's a poetic section in which people are expressing themselves in a certain way. And so I actually, as we read this, and there's going to be a lot of talk about cleanliness and degradation in here, I also wanted to do kind of this passage in stereo with a chapter out of the Gospel of Luke, which I think gives us another view, another kind of part of the song, and how God approaches those things. So, okay, I've talked enough. Let's sit down and read chapter 4, which it's a little longer than some of the readings I've done here, but it's the poems are actually getting shorter. It's 22 verses, and I just want us to read this whole thing. So let's again listen for what God might have to say for us in this kind of difficult passage. So Lamentations chapter 4 says, "How the gold has grown dim, how the pure gold is changed. The holy stones lie scattered at the head of every street. The precious sons of Zion, worth their weight in fine gold. How they are regarded as earthen pots, the work of the potter's hands. Even jackals offer the breast, they nurse their young. But the daughter of my people has become cruel, like the ostriches in the wilderness. The tongue of the nursing infant sticks to the roof of its mouth for thirst. The children beg for food, but no one gives it to them. Those who once feasted on delicacies perish in the streets. Those who were brought up in purple embrace ash heaps. For the chastisement of the daughter of my people has been greater than the punishment of Sodom, which was overthrown in a moment, and no hands were wrung for her. Her princes were purer than snow, whiter than milk. Their bodies were more ruddy than coral, the beauty of their form like sapphire. But now their face is blacker than soot. They are not recognized in the streets. Their skin has shriveled on their bones, and it has become dry as wood. Happier were the victims of the sword than the victims of hunger, who wasted away, pierced by the lack of fruits of the field. The hands of compassionate women have boiled their own children. They became their food during the destruction of the daughter of my people. The Lord gave full vent to his wrath. He poured out his hot anger. He kindled a fire in Zion that consumed its foundations. The kings of the earth did not believe, nor any of the inhabitants of the world, that foe or enemy could enter the gates of Jerusalem. This was for the sins of her prophets and the iniquities of her priests, who shed in the midst of her the blood of the righteous. They wandered blind through the streets. They were so defiled with blood that no one was able to touch their garments. Away, unclean, people cried at them. Away, away, do not touch. And so they became fugitives and wanderers. People said among the nations, they shall stay with us no longer. The Lord himself has scattered them. He will regard them no more. No honor was shown to the priests, no favor to the elders. Our eyes failed, ever watching vainly for help. In our watching we watched for a nation which could not save. They dogged our steps so that we could not walk in our streets. Our end drew near, our days were numbered, for our end had come. Our pursuers were swifter than eagles in the heavens. They chased us on the mountains. They lay in wait for us in the wilderness. The breath of the nostrils, the Lord's anointed, was captured in their pits, of whom we said, under his shadow we shall live among nations. Rejoice and be glad, O daughter of Edom, you who dwell in the land of Uz. But to you also the cup shall pass. You shall become drunk and strip yourself bare. The punishment for your iniquity, O daughter of Zion, is accomplished. He will keep you in exile no longer. But your iniquity, O daughter of Edom, he will punish. He will cover your sins. So the passage in some ways is a little all over the place, and I think that's intentional. I think it is meant to feel like someone kind of lashing out in anger and in frustration at the situation they find themselves. And the major theme here is degradation. We don't tend to think as much in terms of cleanliness and uncleanliness. We have a worldview in which our personalities and our kind of souls are buffered in some ways from things that are around us, from physical things at least. We tend to think internally, we tend to think of things influencing and convincing, right, rather than almost like a charge or an enchantment of touching something that can make us either clean or unclean. But this was very much the way that they thought of things at this point. And this idea of just degradation, of uncleanliness, is all over this passage. We've got, we've got priests and prophets, those who are supposed to be holy and special, are the cause of the degradation. We see, the horror of cannibalism in this passage, this ultimate degradation of ourself, which again we'll remember from anthropology that basically incest and cannibalism are the two kind of strongest taboos across the world. You do not harm, you do not eat your own by any means. And yet this is something people have done because they are so hungry during this siege, this fast. And that's something that the Bible tells us literally happened. These people got so desperate and their souls at this point had gotten so vicious. They ate their own children during this time, and just the degradation of what they do to themselves in this is part of this passage. It's a nasty passage. And I think one of the things that's kind of important for us to learn from this passage is we see what has been done to these people, and it's hard for us not to go towards situations like this with tragedies or when something happens. And I think most of the time our minds are going to start spinning and saying, okay, what's the cause? Who's at fault here, right? And I think we tend to kind of to have kind of a hierarchy of people like the innocent suffering versus those who have kind of brought this on themselves. And the problem here is we have both of those. It's a little hard to swallow at times. If you look at this passage, the people compared to innocents and the nobles, we know that was not in fact the case. They were an incredibly unjust people. They did some very cruel and unkind things, and they did not trust God. They trusted in themselves. And so for some of the people here, they have brought this on themselves. The desperation became so strong that when they are hungry, there's an exposure of who they actually are. The fact that they are eating their children is kind of a literal expression of the way that they've been treating the poor, of the way that they've been treating the land, of taking what they can and just more or less eating them for a long time, treating them as a resource to be used. And there's a lot of anger in books like Jeremiah over the way those who are supposed to be shepherding and helping people are in fact consuming them and hurting them and taking from them, and this injustice, right? But we've also got in this passage people who are completely innocent. We've got a bunch of children. We've got those who have not been part of this leadership, who did not bring them down on themselves. And I think that we have to be willing at times in life to just see this for what it is and not make that fine dividing line, because I think it's messier than that in real life. I think no one is quite as bad to deserve things like this as sometimes we will drop on them. And I don't think anyone is so completely innocent to say that no one deserves suffering. And I'm not saying we need to throw this on people when something bad happens. I think the fault finding tends to be, an issue of control. If we can identify what the problem was, we can tell ourselves that I would have avoided that, right? If someone's kid is totally out of control, if someone has some kind of a sickness, we want to look for a cause. Is it their fault? Did they make these choices? Because I think we're trying to protect ourselves. Well, if I parent better, if I made better choices in life, that can't happen to me. It's a control issue, and we distance ourselves from people, often people who are unclean or in pain or who we disagree with the choices they have made, because we are telling ourselves that can't happen to me. I'm smarter. I'm doing better. I'm protected from such things. And I think passages like this throw that in our face, and it has a pretty negative view of who humanity is in God's eyes. And it has this degradation, this sorrow, some of which is deserved and some of which isn't. It's not clean. It's not clear. It's not safe. It's a filthy mess, just like living in the world often is. And I want to go back to our stereo metaphor and say, okay, so if that's what God often finds in this world, degradation, filth, not easy to lay blame, the innocent are suffering, the deserving are suffering, right? What does God do with this degradation, this idea of uncleanness when he finds it? And we see, I think, a very interesting contrasting passage with this in Luke chapter 5, when Jesus is interacting with someone who has a skin disease, usually what we call leprosy. Looking back, it's, anyway. Because a lot of the time, this disease, this horrific disease, would cut you off from society because people not just didn't want to get it because they didn't have germ theory yet, but their assumption was that their very souls could be tainted by contact with people like this. And we see several times, the disciples and other religious leaders saying, oh, why is this person suffering this? Why have they been degraded with this disease that makes them not just physically sick, but also spiritually sick and unclean? We separate them from us. Why did this happen? And the assumption is, well, God did this because they're bad, because they deserved it, even if they don't realize it yet, right? And so they are separated. And then we see Jesus kind of rejecting that position and having a very different approach to it. So in Luke chapter 5, we read, Jesus was in one of the towns where there was also a man covered with a skin disease. When he saw Jesus, he fell on his face and begged, Lord, if you want, you can make me clean. Jesus reached out his hand, touched him, and said, I do want to. Be clean. And instantly the skin disease left him. Jesus ordered him not to tell anyone. Instead, he said, go show yourself to the priest, make an offering for your cleansing as Moses instructed. This will be a testimony to them. News of him spread even more, and huge crowds gathered to listen, to be healed from their illnesses. But Jesus would withdraw to deserted places for prayer. And so what's so interesting about this passage is, of course, that the way uncleanliness, the way disease, tended to work in both their minds and ours is, if you touch something that is unclean, you as well become unclean. We know that Jesus did not have to touch this man. We've seen miracles from him already at this point where he simply speaks and healing is brought about. And yet, I think there's a kindness into this. Is there one thing that a leper, an unclean person with a skin disease, cannot count on is human contact, right? Nobody is touching them. All their interaction is from a distance. It's throwing. It's social distancing and the frustrations that we've just barely felt for a lifetime with strong spiritual implications. And yet Jesus does the exact opposite. He touches him. He shows his compassion. And whereas uncleanliness is supposed to taint purity, Jesus' cleanliness, Jesus' purity, in fact, goes back and cleanses this man. It makes him pure. It makes him whole again. And there is a bit of a trading here. The Gospel of Luke makes it a little more blunt that because of the news of this healing, he can't go into public places anymore. He has to stay out in the wilderness because the crowds are always after him. Everyone wants healing. And so even here we see a bit of a switch. He allows this unclean man to be restored and re-enter society. And in some ways he trades places with him. And so I think that's the other piece of the stereo. For Jesus and God, right? God recognized kind of the filth and the uncleanness that the world had become, the degradation that our own choices and our own innocence has brought upon ourselves and the world. And rather than hanging back and saying, I got to stay clean, I got to stay away from this stuff, as we tend to do, right? We isolate people, we cut people out, we make them the outsider to protect ourselves. Jesus does the opposite. God comes and lives among humanity. Jesus himself touches and heals and brings his holiness, his cleanliness to these places. And so the question for me is, who are these people in our society? Who are those we feel like we need to stay away from because they are dangerous, because they can harm us in some way, because they deserve to be isolated, right? Who are those people that may frighten us or we feel like can taint us in some way? And what does it look like to follow Jesus, follow God into these places, knowing full well that they're not going to be pleasant, that they are going to cause us pain, and again, that we are not up to doing this on our own. Jesus can go and touch things and make them whole and make them healed. We can't. We can only do that going in his strength and in his Holy Spirit. So this week, nasty passage, but I think it's one I sit with who are people who find themselves in situations like those in Lamentations 4? And I, as both a member of humanity who find myself in that situation, but one who has been offered healing and hope by the God who is not putting up with it, what's my responsibility in following Jesus into those places of healing as best I can, of not letting uncleanliness, whatever that looks like nowadays, to define my life, my actions, my fears, but going in love as Jesus did into those places? Don't have easy answers for that, but that's what I want us chewing on and wrestling with this week in our sacred gathering.